Hello, and welcome to Seeing Jesus with Paul Miller. My name is Liz Voberel, and I'm here with Paul and our colleague John Horry, who trains church leaders here in the U.S. and overseas. In our last episode, we started a conversation about how we lost a sense of Jesus as a person, or to put it another way, how Jesus became a missing person. Today, Paul begins tracing the roots of that loss, beginning with how Christianity lost the Jewish sense of the person. Paul, why don't you bring us into what we'll be talking about today?
Some of the loss goes actually back to the first century. And let me first describe it positively, and then I'll describe it negatively. And let me use Robert Alter, and probably the leading Hebrew scholar, teaches at Berkeley, and Auerbach's, Eric Auerbach's mimesis, actually another Jewish scholar. But their feel for the Hebrew narrative, Old Testament, Eric Auerbach is the one who picked it up. He did his study on Western literature, beginning with the Greeks. During World War II, when he was chased out of Berlin, he had no books with him. So the beauty of mimesis, and I just as a commercial on reading, just read the first 100 pages of mimesis. It'll blow you out of the water. He didn't have any books with him, so he just wrote it sitting there at his typewriter. Without, and if he later on said if he had brought his library with him from Berlin, it would have killed the book. So it was just him personally reacting to literature. And so it's one gigantic inductive Bible study, except he uses a lot of things other than the Bible. So he begins by looking at the Greeks, and he talks about how depersonalized they are. As a Greek, you are defined by your central characteristic. So Achilles in the Iliad is swift. So he's swift Achilles. So everything Achilles does is swift. When he's in battle, he runs. In fact, that's when he's killed, when he's running around Troy and Paris shoots an arrow and shoots him in the heel. And that's his only vulnerable spot. So anyway, and then what Auerbach does in mimesis is he compares that to Jacob. If you look at Jacob, the first part of his life, he is just a scoundrel. He just, everything he does, he's manipulating. He's trying to get an angle on his brother. He's crafty. So if Jacob were in the Iliad or the Odyssey, he would be crafty Jacob. In other words, that chief characteristic would freeze him. It would also be the means of his downfall. It would be to use our metaphor, it would be his Achilles heel. But Jacob and so many other Bible characters, and Robert Alter in his book, The Art of Biblical Narrative, picks this up. Jacob is a center of surprise. He's a person. He actually changes. And you can see that. And as the biblical narrative looks at Jacob, how he reaps what he sows, how he's humbled, as he kind of goes down to a J curve, and how God brings him a resurrection. And so people aren't frozen. And one way of describing the Jewish view of a person is judge not. I mean, Jesus, it's his hardest two-word command that Jesus says in the whole Bible is look at people with an open mind. Don't put them in a box. Hope can happen. People can change. Kind of as you grow older, you get kind of ossified and you learn wisdom that people don't change, and all that kind of sense. Just that beauty of that judge not comes in. So that's part of that. That's part of the Jewish view of a person. And let me just take one of the beautiful things about the Jewish view of the person is how robust it is, like in the lament tradition. So the lament songs, you are completely real before God. God, where are you? God, are you sleeping? God, look away from me. God, have you forgotten your promises? What I do this on our prayer seminar, and I think most of our seminar leaders do some of that version of that, where I'll take a lament from the Message. And let me just take one from Psalm 6. And I'll tell people that I got this from an edgy book on prayers, and I want them to tell me what concerns them about it. So I am leading my witnesses, but they go quickly. So here's Psalm 6. Please, God, no more yelling, no more trips to the woodshed. Here's Psalm 10 from the Message. God, are you avoiding me? Where are you when I need you? And so what people immediately say, oh, they're disrespectful. You shouldn't talk to God that way. And then I read them the ESV, Lord, so Psalm 6, Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. I mean, it's the same ideas exactly. Or Psalm 10, why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? And that the loss of that lament tradition is part of that depersonalization. I would call it a mild depersonalization in Christianity and a mild depersonalization of Jesus. Here's an example of that. I'll ask people in our interactive Person of Jesus study we have 2 lessons on lamenting. And one of them is, what is Jesus doing on the donkey as he's descending down the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem? And or what do every picture you've ever seen of Jesus say? Because some people know now. And every picture, Jesus is happy. He's smiling. He's
on the parade.
Yeah, he's in a parade. He's won the lottery, and no one mentions what Luke tells us, that he's weeping. He's lamenting. And it's actually a lament that he has started before over Jerusalem and the loss of the Jewish people. And so that inability, you can see how the thoughts I'm throwing are kind of complex, but the idea is this loss of a person. One aspect of that is the loss of being real, the loss of an inability to lament. So here's an example. Every sermon I heard growing up on Naomi was she was bitter Naomi, which is actually Greek, that Greek mind. And yet Naomi, now you'll start to see scholars, whoa, she's actually filled with faith.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think if you even think about Jesus, when he was facing the cross in the Garden of Gethsemane, I think in some of our trainings, I've asked people, what do you picture? What's his face like as he's heading towards the cross? And so there's a sense that if we say he was looking forward to it, he couldn't wait to suffer and, be separated from his Father. I mean, any other human being, we would say that person was absolutely insane. And yet we kind of unknowingly sometimes picture Jesus that way, even as he heads to the cross. But if you look at his lament in the garden, he says, let this cup pass from me.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I, when you were saying that, John, I was just thinking, a word like resolute is, I feel like, how we tend to picture him, and then let that one trait sort of drown out any other feeling. Paul, I've heard you talk about this before as a sense of roundedness of a person, right? And that Greek view just takes one angle, one aspect, and it's more of a box versus a round shape, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. And you just think of that little phrase, judge not, it's freezing one frame of the person. And I never quite sure, until you said this, Liz, I never quite sure why I liked the word roundedness, but it's that you're looking at it it's like a hologram, where you're coming at it, where in a hologram, they take a laser and split it in 3 ways. And they take 3 different images of the picture and then of the object and then fuse them. And we've had still photos that have not lacked that kind of roundedness. And out of that comes a richness of what it is to be personal that has so many sides to it. One more thought on Naomi. why is the church labeled bitter Naomi? Because she seems disrespectful. And laments are actually filled with faith because they're taking God honestly. It's no different than my wife saying, you promised to take out the trash, and it's still sitting in the garage, and it's Thursday night, it's 9:00. It's a holding me to my word. It's treating me as a person. And that's what, and so a lament is actually filled with faith, and it's richly personal. It's what we do. We lament in close relationships. We lament to our friend or spouse when someone fails us or they have failed us, so it's actually seems unbelieving, but faith-filled. So the result is that when you kill that view of the person, proper kills the personal. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we do our prayer training and we go into the lesson or the training on lament, I think a lot of the feedback or the comments is that it's so freeing, because it's almost like when people are praying in a very difficult circumstance, they almost have to repress a portion of who they are. There's kind of a muting of the emotion. There's a flattening of their soul, in a sense, so that they can, in their minds, properly relate to God in a respectful way.
Yes.
But in doing so, it kills not only a sense of who they are and what they're feeling, but it really kills your prayer life too.
Right. One of the key factors in losing this sense of the person of Jesus was losing of the first layer of Christianity. So, as N.T. Wright points out, we are within 30, 40 days of Pentecost, there are probably 10,000 Jewish believers. And Christianity at that point was almost completely Jewish. So we're at the year 30, but by the year 56 AD, so 25 years later, Paul is lamenting as a Jew in Romans 9, the rejection of the Jewish people of the gospel. And it breaks his heart. And then he has another reference to it in roughly 62 AD in the book of Colossians, when he just kind of mentions aside, he's in Rome now. He has only 2 Jewish workers with him. And so you already very early on, the Jewish diaspora has largely rejected Jesus. There is a core of Jewish believers. I shouldn't really call them believers. I'll just mention it briefly, that actually retain the person of Jesus. They're called Ebionites. And it's the Hebrew word for the poor. And they are Jewish followers of Jesus who do not believe he's the Messiah. So they believe, they are Jewish followers who believe he's a great teacher. They believe he's a prophet. They believe he's a miracle worker. They believe he's the greatest of the prophets. In fact, they believe he's the Messiah sent from God, but they do not believe in Chalcedon. They do not believe he's God. They do not even believe he is a God, which would be Arianism, which Chalcedon, finally shut the door on, although Nicaea kind of did that too. But so every follower of Jesus, every disciple, Mary Magdalene, every one of them is an Ebionite right up to the resurrection. The resurrection cracks open everything. I mean, that's out of that comes, whoa. I mean, already you're seeing glimpses of his divinity in the Gospels, but the resurrection is, that's when they move from Ebionite to Orthodox Christianity. So anyway, it's just an interesting aside, though, that Ebionites, remember the Jewish love of the physical. So they could affirm Jesus' humanity, but not his divinity. And the flip side of that is Greek Stoicism. And this kind of helps us understand is the Greek mind was the actual inverse of that. His divinity was easy to see. It was his humanity that they struggled seeing. And one of the first ways that you see that coming through is in the fake Gnostic Gospels. They're called, the big fancy word is apocryphal Gospels, made up, the fake news of the second century. We call them just the fake Gospels. But and the early church fathers talk about them. When they discovered the Gospel of Judas, maybe 10 years ago in Egypt, it's only about three pages long. There was a Harvard scholar who was sort of at a big spread in National Geographic, like breathlessly saying, "Oh, this is going to change Christianity." I mean, it just makes my head split, because the early church fathers talked about we knew about these gospels, and they were all written like 150 years later. And all of them begin that this is the hidden secret gospel. So why do they have to say that? Well, if I were to come up now, 150 years after the Gettysburg Address, and say that I had the real Gettysburg Address and that was the fake one, I would have to have an excuse. Why hasn't anybody talked about this for 150 years? So I would say that this has been a secret gospel recently discovered. Okay. So it's just, anyway, bear with me. So in the fake Gospel of Judas, Judas, because he loves Jesus, gives Jesus over to be crucified so Jesus can be rid of his body. That's the Greek mind. It didn't like the body. It's very similar to Buddhism. And there's actually a lot of truth to it. I'm 66 and I'm beginning to dislike my body more as it falls apart. I've torn my left rotator cuff again. I don't know how I did that. And you know what I mean? I went on a 3-hour bike ride in the summer that got my hip messed up. Anyway, it just,
It's a whole nother podcast, really.
That's a whole nother podcast. We'll keep that out of it. I'm just saying, you can see why they say it. And also, it comes from Plato articulates the Greek mind and everything. And the beauty of the Greek mind is that if you look deeply at life, it's the things you can't see that are important, like love, like courage, like honor, beauty. It's the kind of the eternal forms. And that's what Plato said. There must be something, if we have these glimpses, there must be something substantial hidden anyway, that's a very quick summary of Plato. And anyway, Neoplatonism in the 2nd and 3rd century was coming on really strong. It came into the church as Gnosticism. The church rejected it. And it's not so much let me try to get this correctly. It's not so much that Stoicism influenced the Greek church. It is more that I would almost say it this way, is that the Greek mind, that the Hebrew lament tradition had trouble penetrating into it because the Greek mind was so strong. Like that paradigm, that lens was so strong, they just couldn't see the lament tradition. Does that make sense? So it's not like, so when they lost that Jewish layer of Christianity, and it either went Ebionite or distant from Christianity, hostile to Christianity, the Greeks had no capacity for seeing those texts that way. So you'll see it beginning to come in the early church father, particularly the Alexandrian fathers, which interested it was in that, so Egypt, that a lot of our Gnostic gospels are found in Egypt. Anyway, that's probably too much information. Here, let me give you one other lens of this, just one way of looking at this. Every single Greek Gnostic would love the opening to John, where it talks about the word, the Logos, which was from the beginning, was the word, and the word was God. I mean, that's just like, they would be salivating. Yes, 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 yes. And then when you came to verse 14, that's when the Greek Gnostic would choke. Because the word, then John says, after this incredible thing on the word, then John says, the word became flesh and tabernacled among us, dwelt among us, camped among us, pitched his tent among us. John is bringing the idea of God tabernacling in the Old Testament, that the embodied, the Logos is embodied in a body, was like crazy for them, So, John, in the Gospel of John in particular, is fighting a two-front war against the Ebionites, who wanted a disembodied Jesus. So we get those rich, I think the richest portrayals of the person of Jesus are in John. He's got the video camera. I mean, it's just in slow motion all through John. And then yet he's fighting the Ebionite problem at the same time, where he's, where you have the clearest statements of Jesus' divinity in John. So it's a two-front war that John is doing.
That's great to hear from that angle, specifically for John, because typically when people become Christians for the first time, usually they're offered the gospel according to John. And so to be able to see that they're potentially getting a very well-rounded picture of Jesus from the get-go is just naturally encouraging.
Yeah. Sorry, I've been thinking about this for 30 years. So if I take up all the airtime, guys, this is emotions made Stoics nervous. Okay, if you've been in an argument lately, you know why. Okay. I love the beginning of Marcus Aurelius. If you watch the movie Gladiator, he's the great Stoic emperor with his just an evil son in the beginning of the movie Gladiator, calm, steady. At the beginning of his book, The Meditations, little booklet, he basically, I'm paraphrasing it. It's basically, how do you get through the day when you're going to meet a lot of idiots? And he's basically, you rise above them. You have a vision of the good. And what's just spectacular about the Gospels is Jesus washes the feet of idiots. He rebukes them. He eats with them. He's the fully embodied, incarnate God descending into their world. He picks up his hammer and saw like all the other blue collar workers of Galilee. I mean, it just, that the flesh dwelt among us was just, So the emotions made Stoics nervous. That's why, and that Greek mind then imprinted the church. That's why you have 1900 years till you get to any thoughtful study of the person of Jesus outside of sermons and a few things like that by any scholar of any depth. And that's why it's actually in the English speaking world, it's even worse. Let me give you one example. In John 11, and Warfield points this out in his study, The Emotional Life of Our Lord. In John 11, twice, I think it's verse 33 and 37, Jesus uses this word embrazo, which is angry. And no English translation, actually I came across one, says anger. Luther in the German translations, maybe because Luther was just this blue collar, feisty, son of a mine owner, and beer drinker. The German translations pick up Jesus' anger, but no English translation. English culture has a kind of a stoic bent on its own. It's kind of, what was Churchill's little slogan for World War II? Carry on.
Keep calm and
carry on. It's just very practical advice when bombs are dropping around you, but it has a kind of a stoic tint to it. So
not go lament somewhere.
Yeah, right. Although Churchill, I'm reading a biography of Churchill. Churchill has his laments on Germany. He's actually very funny. But that whole idea of keep your emotions under control, keep stable. And why do we not mention Jesus' anger at the tomb? It just feels uncomfortable. Anger feels uncomfortable. It's disruptive. It's unsettling. Him weeping on the donkey just messes up the whole scene. We have millions of Sunday school pictures that would be messed up by that, And so it's very similar to Buddhist thought, rising above the mess. The Neoplatonism had this great chain of being where you want to go higher up the chain. So in the fake Gospel of Thomas, which liberals love, but they don't like this part of it, because Jesus tells Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of Thomas that he's going to make her into a man. Now that makes perfect sense in the first and second century, because they saw women as lower on the chain of being. They're more emotional. So by making her into a man, he's going to move her up the chain of being. By the way, when I say that in seminars, I hide behind the podium because it's just, I say, I'm quoting them. I disagree with this. But so don't throw anything at me.
Well, I remember growing up in Sunday school, and every now and then, the big treat was being able to watch a film about Jesus. And I'm not talking about video or YouTube, but back then in the 70s, it was literally a film reel that would be going. And as I look back and remember, I envisioned those movies, Jesus in those movies, as kind of floaty. Right. There's usually kind of a soft glow, and almost as if his feet weren't on the ground. And I think that's kind of indicative of what you're talking about, Paul. And there's a sense that you want to portray that in the filmmaker's minds, I guess, that he really is God. And that is obviously true. That's part of the beginning of the Gospel according to John. But maybe sometimes the filmmakers lost the verse 14 part of it.
One of the classic descriptions of Jesus' embodiment is from the Gospel of John. Let me just read it here. This is Peter and John now have come into the tomb. It's resurrection morning. And stooping to look in, he, that is John, saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. And then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. That's 3 verses in John, and it's like they're at a laundromat. I mean, I have to count the number of references to, there are 4 references to the linen, to 2 different linen cloths, descriptions of where they are and what they're like. And I got this from Vern Poitras, a professor at Westminster, that what was the first thing Jesus did after his resurrection? He made his bed. I don't know if any of you have read the new little book by the former admiral who is head of the Navy SEALs, written to millennials. And I think the title of the book is Make Your Bed. Yeah. We've given it to some of our kids and grandkids, and they start making their beds, It's just so physical. It's just so embodied. And at that point, it looks like John believes. It just, wow. And he doesn't believe because of the writing, but he believes now in the resurrection. He just doesn't know where the body is. So John and Peter were the first 2 to believe. Mary is the first one to see and believe. But he washes the disciples' feet and he makes beds. We're sort of doing one ongoing commercial for reading other books, but Sight and Sound Theater in Lancaster has a new play on Jesus. It's well worth seeing. I think it's their best play, but they pick up from the Gospel of Luke that Luke's sitting on the swaddling clothes in the manger and the clothes that are wrapped around Jesus' body at the end. And they actually, I'm stealing the thunder of the show, but if you can't get to it, it's really powerful. So they have on the left side of the stage, they have the manger scene with the swaddling clothes, and the right side, Jesus being wrapped. And the gospel writers are clearly seeing the poetry of that. They're doing an inclusio of his life. And it's kind of like they're seeing something. It's the beauty of the incarnation that is, they're overcome by that. And kind of what we're talking about is Stoicism has an allergy to the incarnation. And how does this, let me give you an example of how this affects preaching. Let me just go 180 degrees and talk about sex. If you're going to float, I think every other Sunday, a sermon, a pastor, given how powerful sexual temptation is in our culture, ought to be talking about sex. Even if it's just a commercial, like a 1 minute, no, all right, no adultery this week, guys, just, and it's that floating sex is, I think half of all guys are being eaten alive by some kind of sexual temptation. And it's floating above life, but we've got to get down into life. We got to talk about where people are at. Naomi, you got to talk about where's Naomi at? She's grieving. Where is Martha at? Coming as she's talking with the angels, she's lamenting. Where are guys at? They are trapped by sexual sin. You've got to talk to where they were at. So hope you don't get too dizzy with this, but I just read a book recently on Paul Revere's Ride by a historian. And when the word went out from Paul Revere and a couple other writers, mainly Paul Revere though, the first thing the militias did in Lexington, Concord, and all the surrounding cities was they gathered, they mustered, and they asked their preacher to come and say, what do we do? Do we fight? Do we fight the British? Do we wait? Their preachers were in talking about what was really big in their life, and that there was this huge garrison in Boston of British soldiers. What did they do? And I just think that, so that's just a commercial for pastors and teachers. Talk about where people are living and go into their world, incarnate with them.
Churchill and Paul Revere. Paul, it reminds me of your shorthand for, I think it was an earlier See Jesus mission, was crush Gnosticism.
Yes, I thought about a great slogan that was. Yeah, I got crush Gnosticism from, I think it was Nike's slogan, sort of internal slogan of crush Adidas or something. So I thought, why not crush Gnosticism? What a way to connect with just the ordinary viewer, that they would immediately vibrate to that. Of course not. Anyway, let me balance this out a little bit by going forward to the 4th century, sort of beginning. So this is when Christianity gets political power, beginning with the Roman Emperor Constantine. Peter Brown, and particularly I'm going to reference the work of Peter Brown, a scholar who's almost created this field of the ancient. It's kind of the end of the ancient world, beginning of the Christian world. There's been a lot of work done on that world, but particularly his book, Through the Eye of the Needle. It is true that Stoicism blunted Christianity's view of the person, and we lost the lament tradition, and there was this muting down of emotions in Christianity. But in general, Christianity offered a whole new way of looking at the person. And that triumphed in the 4th century. And Peter Brown's book, Through the Eye of the Needle, is one of the biggest ways. It happened through sex and wealth. I'll just talk about wealth because I already talked about sex, but it talked about wealth and the rock star of the 300s, 4th century, was Saint Anthony of Egypt, a hermit who gave up everything. The biography of him, oh golly, I think Athanasius wrote the biography of Saint Anthony, rocked the Roman world. It was a bestseller. He was like the Beatles of the 4th century. And Christianity went cold turkey on money, sex, and power, which absolutely dominated paganism. Christianity, largely through Augustine and Ambrose, this is the late 300s, and what's the guy who went to
Jerome?
Jerome, yeah, and Jerome had one of their visions was very much they led the church through the rich young ruler's vision, and it became the in thing that captured the Roman imagination to give away all your money. And what finally broke the camel's back was then the wealthiest couple in the Roman world. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing their names right. Pininius and Melania, who are the Bill and Melinda Gates. Nice, the Melinda and Melania sound the same, of their day. Uber wealthy, unbelievably wealthy, shocked the Roman world by giving up all their money. And it just had all these reverberations through Roman society. It became the in thing to endow, for a rich person, to endow their date of death with a party for the poor. So you would have picnic tables at your gravesite so you could have an annual party for the poor. It's just remarkable stuff like that. But anyway, Christianity crushed ancient paganism with a better view of the person. It was weakened by what we've talked about here, but in general, compassion became a value. Generosity became a value. Generosity to the poor became a value. It transformed the ancient mind, and you had the birth of Western Christendom.
I just love that because I feel like everything, the way you described the culture at the time, can be indicative of our time, and to know that there is hope for whether it be crushing Gnosticism or addressing the issues of the day, that the hope is this vision of the good, of the beauty of the person of Jesus embodied in the people of God is still at work today.
Amen. Amen, John. That brings us to a close for today's episode. We've traced the roots of our loss of Jesus as a person through the loss of the Jewish sense of the person, and then on through the influence of the Greek mind. In 2 weeks, we'll pick the story up and carry it forward to the present day. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at podcast@cjesus.net. As you've probably heard, Paul has a new book out called J-Curve, Dying and Rising with Jesus in Everyday Life. If you sign up at sayjesus.net/podcast, we'll send you a free PDF sample of the book, as well as a short email with highlights each time we release a new episode. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you in a couple weeks.